feeling trapped. A Zen sleep story to find freedom. Right now, there is a localized sharp ache resting directly between the small bones of your wrists and the outer edge of your forearms. It is the distinct physical anchor of claustrophobia within a false sanctuary. The heavy somatic residue carried by someone who has spent the daylight hours freezing their potential inside a situation that provides perfect outward security, but completely suffocates internal growth. You are experiencing the deep structural exhaustion of a life lived behind the protective fortress of a comfortable prison, where every day looks identical because you have traded the vulnerability of true alignment for the predictable safety of a dead routine. Your forearms are holding the tight, unyielding chill of a system that has clamped its own exit gates shut, locking your wrists in a defensive grip to prevent any sudden movement toward the unknown. Your mind is running its hypervigilance programs even now, trying to justify the containment, tracking the walls of your comfort zone as if they were a sanctuary rather than a tomb. The quiet shelter of your room is adjusting to the early winter evening, offering a damp, grounded sanctuary where the ceaseless momentum of your self-protection can be allowed to coast to a complete halt. Outside, a heavy fog is blanket wrapping the lower slopes of the rocky ridge, sealing the mountain clefts in an unhurried, freezing stillness that requires no active defense from the stone. Inside, the deep, dark aroma of damp slate rises softly from a row of wet pavers near the threshold, blending naturally with the clean, faint smell of ancient timber tannin that drifts from a heavy cedar chest in the corner. The low, blue-gray light of a single oil wick burning down in a shallow stone dish casts long, motionless shadows across the rough-sawn walls, while the thick, tightly woven mat beneath your spine absorbs the heavy pressure of your upper frame. The unrefined, cool texture of the flax sheets beneath your wrists begins to draw the residual, nervous heat away from your skin, gently inviting the deep connective tissues of your forearms to drop their protective alignment. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the full weight of your arms sink back into the stable center of the bedding, allowing the complex structures of your security to remain completely unmonitored in the dark. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are tracking in this localized, sharp restriction across your wrists and forearms is not a personal failure, nor is it a sign that you have permanently lost your courage because you have lingered too long in a safe situation that no longer serves your spirit. The profound stagnation you carry tonight is a wise, natural message, a stark physical indication that your system has simply outgrown its enclosure, crying out because you have tried to freeze a dynamic life into an unyielding cage to avoid the vulnerability of change. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately locate the strength to shatter your comfort zone before you are allowed to rest. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to figure out how to escape your golden cage before your hands are allowed to let go of their tightness. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a profound, liberating paradox within the heart of Buddhist insight that speaks directly to this exhaustion of the false sanctuary through a surprising, unyielding truth. We live under the persistent illusion that our safety in the world is a structural creation, believing that if we can only build an enclosure thick enough to keep out the unpredictable storms of circumstance, we will finally achieve the right to exist in peace. We treat our lives as an ongoing preservation project, constantly sealing every window and wedging every door to outrun the terrifying vulnerability of being touched by the unknown. But the ancient wisdom of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise because you are exposed to the changing elements outside. The deepest agony takes root when the mind mistakes its artificial structures for its actual home. This is the truth of the sun-starved well curb, when a circular stone wall built over a fresh mountain spring is sealed over so tightly with heavy timber planks to exclude falling leaves. The water inside turns sour, dark, and stagnant, not because the spring has died, but because the enclosure has cut off the vital air and light needed to clear the current. The suffering is not the presence of the storm, but the refusal to let the roof be opened. True rest is not the maintenance of the fortress, it is the realization that your value was never resting on the enclosure. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, Hollow panic at midnight when you realize that despite executing a perfectly secure lifestyle, the internal space within your chest still feels completely flat, parched, and thinned. The mind turns inward, transforming this structural claustrophobia into a harsh personal judgment, whispering that because you feel trapped, you are fundamentally ungrateful, weak, and lacking in true ambition. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the simple fatigue of a long day. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral limitation of a human spirit that has gone numb from staying too long in a dead space to survive a chaotic world. The second pain is the cruel indictment you strike against your own forearms, declaring that your stagnation is a moral failing that must be corrected through even harder self-scrutiny tomorrow. But the wet slate does not apologize to the gorge for its shadows, and the stagnant water does not feel remorse for its darkness under the wood. The ache you feel across your wrists is merely a temporary configuration of form, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is holding your room tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a damp, moss-covered stone well house at the edge of an abandoned bamboo grove, where a young scholar sat staring at a corroded copper key with a split bow, carrying the exact same sharp restriction that is binding your forearms right now. But before we step onto that cold stone floor, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your hands. Let the deep spaces between your wrist bones and your elbows widen. Let the forearm muscles release their defensive bracing, and let the small tendons around your fingers give up their tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. The world will manage its own heavy structures without your constant supervision for the next few hours, and every comfortable prison, every unshared truth, and every sun-starved well curb can remain completely stranded in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our security as a monument that must be continuously fortified against the void, believing that if we allow the preservation to stop for even a single hour, we will fall instantly into chaos. We evaluate our stability by the thickness of our walls, and then we wonder why our lower arms feel like cold iron when the daylight fades. But the vast mountain ridge does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining exposed, rugged, and empty beneath the winter stars. And the frozen moss does not apologize to the sky for freezing its growth. The numbness you hold does not come from the simple fact that you value safety. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the spring remain open, without demanding that your core immediately justify its existence through more containment. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its pacing or prove its depth. Let it move directly into the tight channels of your wrists, down through the backs of your forearms, and deep into the very center of your palms. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, boundaries, and optimized enclosures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool mountain air is moving through the wet wood outside, requiring no final choices and demanding no perfect transformations before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the flax beneath your calves as we prepare to step onto the damp stone floor of the well house, where the keeper of the springs is waiting to show us how to let the planks slide. Deep within the damp, moss-covered stone well house at the furthest edge of the abandoned bamboo grove, where the creeping autumn fog turned the dark stalks into faint, vertical shadows, the air remained heavy with the clean scent of wet slate and old iron. Inside this small, windowless sanctuary, a young scholar named Haru moved with a sharp, localized restriction that seemed locked directly into the delicate bones of his wrists and the outer muscles of his forearms. Years earlier, Haru had fled the unpredictable chaos of the capital after a sudden political shift destroyed his family's standing, choosing to lock himself away in this remote valley outpost to serve as a copyist for ancient legal records. He had built a life of absolute, unassailable security within these thick stone walls, executing his daily transcriptions with a desperate, precise consistency. He optimized every movement to ensure that nothing unexpected could ever breach his routine. utilizing the heavy oak door and the iron bolts as a complete psychological shield against the terrifying vulnerability of the outside world. Every evening, even after extinguishing the oil wick, Haru's hands remained tightly curled, his forearms holding the rigid structural freeze of a system that had traded its dynamic expansion for a permanent, comfortable sanctuary. He treated his isolation not as a temporary refuge, but as an absolute fortress, believing that if he never allowed a single unpredicted relationship or spontaneous choice to enter his life, he would outrun the pain of his past exposure. He filled his cell with neat stacks of parchment, wedging the shutters tight against the mountain wind until the interior atmosphere grew thick, dry, and stagnant. Yet the more flawlessly he secured his boundaries against the elements, the sharper the localized ache settled into his wrists, leaving his upper limbs feeling like braced timber frames that could no longer pivot or soften. The keeper of the valley springs was Elder Sosi, an old wellwright whose long gray robes were permanently damp at the hem from working in the subterranean channels, and whose slow, deliberate presence held the unhurried depth of a subterranean aquifer. Sosei did not offer elaborate spiritual definitions to the villagers who came to fill their buckets, choosing instead to spend his twilights clearing dead roots from the masonry joints, or oiling the heavy wooden spring gates that fed the mountain streams. He had been quietly observing the progressive hardening of Haru's reach, noting how the young scholar gripped his water jug with an aggressive defensive leverage, and how his wrists remained unyielding, even when the path grew slick with mountain mud. On an evening when the heavy fog turned the surrounding bamboo grove into a completely silent white vault, Sosei called the copyist into the lowest tier of the damp wellhouse. The stone chamber was profoundly cold, save for the slow, heavy echo of water drops falling from a high granite lintel into a deep pool below, and the faint scent of wet earth rising from the floor pavers. On the center of a worn slate bench lay a corroded copper key with a split bow, its intricate metal teeth caked in a dark layer of mineral crust and green oxidation that had built up from years of being left in the locked position. Haru stood near the bench, his forearms rigid, his wrists throbbing with a tight restriction as he prepared to offer a detailed structural plan on how the key could be polished using fine sand, his intellect instantly working to solve the mechanism without touching the cold metal. The old wellwright did not reach for a file, and he did not comment on the young man's analytical strategy. Instead, Sosi picked up the corroded copper key, held its split bow between his calloused thumb and forefinger, and without turning toward the iron gate, he asked Haru to look closely at the shape of the teeth and notice if the key was jammed because the lock was too complex, or if the metal itself had grown heavy from never leaving the keyhole. Haru bent over the slate bench, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, painful wave of emotional recognition as he examined the object under the dim amber glow of the oil wick. The copper key had not been bent by an external blow, rather, because it had been kept turned tightly in the lock for decades to keep the heavy door sealed against the valley. The mineral-rich condensation of the spring had settled into the grooves, hardening into an unyielding crust that completely fused the teeth to the barrel. He looked up at the old wellwright, his own forearms vibrating with a dull, unspent sorrow as the image of the corroded copper mirrored the exact state of his own self-protection. He confessed, his fingers tightening against his thighs as his voice dropped its formal academic mask, that his own upper limbs felt exactly like this locked key, a braced, thin space where he had been keeping his boundaries clamped shut out of fear, believing that if he ever opened the door to the changing seasons, his life would be completely destroyed by the storm. Elder Sosi laid the caked key back down onto the wet slate, not with force, but with a gentle resonant click that echoed softly through the deep chamber, letting the metal rest independent of any human grip. He looked at the young copyist and told him that the error of the fortress is not the thickness of its masonry, but the delusion that a living spring can maintain its clarity by completely excluding the sky. Sosi pointed out that the lock did not preserve the sanctuary, it merely ensured that the rot within the cell would never be cleared by the mountain wind. The sharp ache Haru carried across his wrists did not exist because the world outside was dangerous. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of keeping his system bolted in place, refusing to let the heavy door swing open because he feared what would remain if his protection dropped away. Haru stood perfectly still on the damp pavers, the deep scent of the timber tannin and the cold aroma of the slate moving into his core as his forearms slowly began to drop their defensive brace. For the first time in many winters, the localized, sharp restriction running across his wrist bones began to lose its edge, allowing a deep, unhurried breath to reach the lowest chambers of his abdomen. He looked down at the empty bench, realizing that the absolute certainty he had been trying to build through isolation was a phantom. The day was already finished. The valley was silent, and the only thing keeping the pressure alive was his own refusal to let the gates move. Slowly, the heavy, unhurried stillness of that damp well-house moves into the quiet arena of your own room tonight, letting the image of the resting copper mirror the exact condition of your own over-fortified mind. You have been lying awake, counting the walls of your sanctuary, measuring the depth of the sharp restriction inside your forearms, and letting the fear of vulnerability convince you that your existence is only safe when it is completely enclosed. You have believed that because you cannot guarantee the safety of the path outside, you must permanently freeze your potential within a dead routine. But the deep, unmeasured baseline of your true nature remains completely uncompromised, entirely separate from the walls that have confined your spirit. Let the key rest on the slate, allowing your awareness to settle into the wide, unburdened depth of this single hour. This reflection on the corroded copper key and the sealed slate chamber is not telling us to stop feeling the very real impacts of our life changes, nor is it asking us to become cold, indifferent entities who never seek comfort or build a stable framework to protect our soft places. It is not an invitation to force ourselves into an artificial, detached state where we pretend that outgrowing a long-held career path or realizing a relationship has run out of space does not produce a genuine, sharp restriction directly across our wrist bones and forearms. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a gentle shift in internal posture that allows us to recognize when our protective walls have transformed into an oppressive cage. The persistent, heavy tightness that locks your lower arms tonight does not exist simply because you chose safety during a difficult season of your past. The deepest suffering takes root when the mind insists on keeping the door bolted long after the mountain storm has cleared, mistaking an emergency shelter for a permanent home. When we look at this habit of choosing a comfortable prison through the clear, simple lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often call attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive clamping in the wrists that declares, "Until I can guarantee that the path outside is perfectly safe and predictable, my system is forbidden to experience a single moment of expansive movement." It is the exhausting habit of using absolute containment as a shield against uncertainty, desperately trying to freeze the dynamic current of your growth just to outrun the raw, unpredictable vulnerability of being touched by life. We treat our boundaries as if they were iron bars that must never allow a single unexpected element to pass. And when the day leaves us numb, we wonder why the water inside our well curb has turned dark, heavy, and sour. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic Latinite looping that keeps us mentally reinforcing the walls of our comfort zone, hoping that one more layer of security will finally grant us permission to breathe. But a copper key caked in dark mineral crust cannot rotate within the lock, no matter how many times you turn the problem over in your thoughts. The transcription of the afternoon has already ended. The parchment sheets have been stacked in the dark. The valley has settled into the gray fog. When we lie awake burning our remaining vital energy to maintain these heavy mental enclosures, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, neutral pain of having outgrown a space that once protected you, the natural sorrow of realizing that the career, the routine, or the dynamic that kept you safe 3 winters ago has now become too narrow for the expanse of your current spirit. This experience is genuinely heavy, but it belongs to the basic, unpreventable weather of a growing life. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own forearms when our thoughts turn inward and declare, Because you feel suffocated and heavy in this safe life, you are fundamentally ungrateful, weak, and broken. Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the sharp ache in your wrists and arms right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for structural certainty with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex discipline that you must perform perfectly before you are permitted to let your muscles soften. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the walls of your false sanctuary without allowing the fear of the outside world to dictate the width of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid restriction in your lower arms, to label it gently as the old habit of keeping the door bolted, and to recognize that the crust belongs entirely to the mineral condensation, not to the wide, open spring that is holding you tonight. When you allow the key to rest on the slate bench without continuously forcing the mechanism with your thoughts, you stop feeding the analytical frost that keeps your skin raw. You let the old fortress exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked heart. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental weight of your current routine is not a solid, eternal mountain trapped inside your soul. That grand arrangement of comfort was a temporary shelter that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this bed is entirely separate from those windowless stone walls. Its forearms, capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of an enclosure. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive freeze just to protect a prison that has already returned to the silence of the bamboo grove. True letting go does not mean you stop caring about your safety, or that you pretend your claustrophobia does not feel heavy. It means you stop using the thickness of your walls as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the caked, thin channels of your past self-protection. Look at the dark water with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the door to swing where it wills, without demanding that your life become perfectly mapped out before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your existence must always hold an intact display of absolute certainty for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external return. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the heavy structures you tried to preserve during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the tightness of the window frames before it agrees to warm your limbs, and your lungs do not demand an intact agreement from the valley before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human containment, resting securely within a night that requires no final choices before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the flax beneath your wrists as we prepare to step onto the cool wood floor of the mountain reservoir shed, where the old nun is waiting to show us how to let the planks slide away from the rim. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right along the narrow, delicate spaces between the small bones of your wrists, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that sharp, localized ache has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the dead routine away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely silent by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn, thinned tightness behind your forearms and thumbs, as if you were merely looking at a heavy, caked copper key resting on a dark slate bench, without any urgency to polish the crust or force the iron bolts to instantly slide. As you rest here in the deep, indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your forearms, your elbow joints, and the lowest tendons of your fingers. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your lower wrists drop their protective brace, allowing the palms to roll upward naturally, and let your lower abdomen feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the damp slate-lined floor beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or full of dry friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of an unfortified space. Right now, let the specific memory of that suffocating environment float up into your awareness, perhaps the exact moment where you felt you were outgrowing your sanctuary, the exhaustion of watching your protective rules multiply without an answer, or the general, heavy worry that you will be permanently cut off from safety if anyone sees the unshielded space in your history. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past decision, and do not try to fix the security record of the day that has gone. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your wrists. You might say to yourself very quietly, this is the habit of bolting the cell, or this is the old defensive frost trying to freeze the open spring. Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal laboratory and standing beside Elder Sosi on the wet pavers, looking at the caked sediment from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your remaining worries are like that heavy, caked copper key, its natural capacity having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous, dry isolation. Look at its encrusted shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough material today, fixing your sight entirely upon the spent definition, letting that cold restriction convince you that your true nature has been permanently parched. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure a structural certainty, that persistent wish to hide your natural vulnerability beneath a mountain of routine, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the hollow, mineral-encrusted bow of the key. You do not have to build a fortress across the valley with your exhaustion, and you do not have to decipher the infinite mystery. You are simply setting the implement down on the slate, while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your lower arms as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the caked, dry copper begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the winter evening. Imagine the thick, sun-baked crust of oxidation beginning to soften naturally, its dark layers expanding, splitting, and flaking away from the underlying metal under the gentle pressure of the damp air, leaving the unlined stone curb of your awareness completely clear and open beneath the surface. The faint, dark aroma of damp slate rises from the pavers, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced execution of logic. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the bench does not diminish the capacity of the stone to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured field that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the legal records, the expectations of the village markets, or the structures you wish you could fortify to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its protective rooms. The sliss of the candle wick outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the corroded copper key. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its frost through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the gatekeeper rest on the bench, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner vault wide, unencored, and deeply at peace. Further up the rocky mountain ridge, where the narrow stone ledges were constantly buffeted by the high, cold gusts of the upper valley, a small, isolated reservoir shed offered a different kind of quiet enclosure. The air within this high outpost stayed raw and sharp, carrying the heavy scent of old cedar wood, frozen mountain lichen, and the deep, clean dampness of mountain runoff. In this solitary workspace lived Jiro, an advanced monastic builder whose entire upper limbs carried an unyielding, rigid freeze that locked his wrists in an eternal brace. Years before, Jiro had been tasked with protecting the purity of the temple's primary water source, a pristine mountain spring that bubbled out of a deep fissure in the granite bedrock, driven by an intense inner anxiety that some stray bird, a falling autumn leaf, or an unexpected storm would contaminate the water and bring disgrace upon his guardianship. He had spent 2 winters constructing a massive, flawless wooden roof directly over the stone well curb. He optimized the enclosure with meticulous precision, shaping heavy pine planks and wedging them together tightly with hand-planed alignment blocks, until not a single sliver of light or a breath of wind could penetrate the chamber. He operated under the stubborn illusion that his worth as a builder was measured by his ability to maintain an unblemished, static environment, using his carpentry as a permanent shield against the messy unpredictability of nature. He ignored the progressive, localized ache that settled deep into his wrists from driving the heavy timber home, believing that his structural hypervigilance was the only true way to serve the sanctuary. Yet, the more perfectly he sealed the spring from the changing patterns of the sky, the darker and more thinned his own internal environment became, until the water inside the cistern began to emit a heavy, sour odor of rot, turning the once vibrant flow into a stagnant black pool because it was entirely starved of sun and movement. The elder guide of the high ridge structures was Sister Miyoko, an old nun whose knuckles were split and hardened from decades of handling stone, and whose slow, deliberate presence held the absolute, neutral stability of the mountain itself. Mayoko did not offer abstract spiritual diagrams or deliver long-winded commentaries to the monks who worked the upper slopes, choosing instead to spend her hours checking the mountain intake vents or using a simple, unpolished pine roof wedge to adjust the old timber rafters when the seasons changed. She had been quietly tracking the progressive freezing of Jiro's arms, observing how he held his tools with a desperate, white-knuckled leverage, and how his shoulders remained hunched in a defensive posture, even when the working day had fully dissolved into twilight. On a night when the early winter frost turned the surrounding rocks into a slippery, silver vault, Mayoko called the young builder into the dark repository. The timber shed was profoundly silent, save for the low, rhythmic gurgle of the trapped water beneath the floorboards and the cold draft whistling through the high eaves. On the center of a low cedar bench lay a hand-planed pine roof wedge, its soft grain deeply marked by the crushing pressure of the massive beams it had been holding in place for 20 moons. Jiro stood near the bench, his forearms locked, his wrists throbbing with a sharp, persistent ache as he prepared to offer an intricate structural explanation for why the roof must be reinforced with even thicker timbers, his mind racing to defend the enclosure against the silent evidence of the sour water. The old stonecutter did not point to the black pool, and she did not question his loyalty to the temple rules. Instead, Mayoko picked up the hand-planed pine roof wedge, held its tapered edge under the dim glow of the oil wick, and asked Jiro to consider whether the wedge was carved to lock the roof into an eternal monument, or if its shape was meant to allow the builder to adjust the space when the wood began to warp from its own dampness. Jiro looked at the simple block of wood resting across her palms, the raw texture of the crushed pine fiber catching the amber light, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, heavy wave of emotional recognition. The object had not split from an external catastrophe, rather, because he had driven it so aggressively into the joists to eliminate every natural gap. The wood had been compacted until it lost all its natural resilience, turning into a dry, rigid mass that was slowly causing the surrounding timber to buckle under its own unyielding weight. He looked at the old nun, his own wrists vibrating with a deep, unspent exhaustion as the image of the crushed wedge mirrored the exact state of his own self-protection. He confessed, his voice dropping its defensive architecture and trembling against the dark, that his own upper limbs felt exactly like this jammed block, a rigid, thinned space where he had been forcing his life to stay inside a closed boundary out of fear. believing that if he allowed the planks to move or let the changing sky touch the spring, his entire sense of security would dissolve into absolute ruin. The old nun did not offer an immediate plan for a new structure, and she did not pretend that opening the spring would be free from the risk of falling debris. Instead, she placed the pine wedge back into his stiff fingers, stepped toward the low edge of the heavy timber roof, and with a quiet, unhurried gesture, asked him to perform one small act of discipline, not to tear down the entire fortress by force, but to simply remove the single corner wedge and sit quietly in the dark with the space that opened up between the wood and the stone. Jiro stood perfectly still on the damp floorboards, his forearms trembling as he leaned down and slowly pulled the compressed pine wedge out of its tight pocket, letting the heavy timber beam settle onto the masonry with a low, resonant groan. As the alignment shifted, a narrow, 2-inch gap opened up along the eastern rim of the well curb, allowing a single, cool current of winter night air to pass directly across the dark surface of the water, bringing with it the crisp, wild scent of the frozen forest outside. He did not become a magically perfect master in that single moment, and he did not instantly erase the deep, sour color of the stagnant pool beneath the boards, but he made one profound, subtle shift in his relationship with his own suffering. He lowered his hands, put down the urge to drive the wedge back into the joist, and simply sat down on the low cedar bench, choosing to live with the uncertainty of the open gap in the dark. He stopped the habit of treating his fearful thoughts as an absolute truth, allowing his forearms to drop their defensive leverage without needing to secure the entire mountain tonight. This was the quiet transformation, a sudden, grounding realization that the spring remains a living sanctuary, whether it is exposed to the wind or sheltered by stone, holding its capacity for clarity within a wide, dynamic presence that no human enclosure can ever permanently capture. As the midnight fog drifted through the small opening in the roof, the sharp, localized restriction along his wrist bones began to lose its rigid edge, letting his awareness return to the simple, stable reality of the earth beneath his frame. He recognized that his true sanctuary was not the flawless, airtight roof he had been striving so fiercely to preserve, but the enduring movement of the water itself, which could receive the wind, the leaves, and the starlight without ever losing its original nature. When we turn our awareness inward to examine the sharp, localized ache currently holding the small bones of your wrists and the outer muscles of your forearms, we begin to map the intricate emotional mechanism that converts the raw vulnerability of transition into a permanent state of internal suffocation. We often believe that this feeling of being trapped or spiritually stagnant is an external accident, a simple consequence of having chosen the wrong sanctuary or remaining too long in a dead career or hollow routine. But if you look closely at the deep, unyielding tension around your tendons tonight, you will see that this claustrophobia is actually an active, ongoing construction of the intellect. It is the somatic consequence of using absolute control as a defensive armor, an exhausting, energetic effort to resist the fluid, changing movements of reality by sealing your life inside an airtight enclosure of absolute predictability. We treat our minds as a constant timber framing yard, continuously measuring, pinning, and sealing every window under the tragic delusion that if we can maintain a flawless boundary, we will finally be safe from the risk of being hurt by the unknown. This habitual reliance on an artificial fortress is a deeply rooted form of resistance against the natural uncertainty of existence. When an unexpected change occurs, perhaps a sudden shift in a close alignment, the realization that your current role no longer reflects your internal growth, or the quiet dread of facing the formless space beyond your comfort zone, the mind experiences a profound sense of threat. Instead of allowing the raw texture of that vulnerability to be felt, the intellect immediately steps forward to take command, working at an immense frantic velocity to categorize and protect the space. We reinforce our rules, we overanalyze our motives, and we map out endless safety strategies, operating under the assumption that keeping our life perfectly closed is the only true way to prevent contamination. But this constant hypervigilance acts exactly like the heavy pine roof planks. Driven tightly over the sun-starved well curb, it creates an impenetrable, stagnant crust of self-protection that completely chokes out the air and light, leaving the wrists locked in a white-knuckled grip, while the living spring of your original nature turns sour and dark beneath the surface. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological structures the mind builds on top of it. Simple Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma by making a direct, compassionate distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral impact of being alive in a world constructed out of changing forms, temporary structures, and natural human boundaries. It is the sudden arrival of an empty evening. It is the raw sensation of realizing you have outgrown a routine that once nurtured you. It is the simple, unavoidable sorrow that occurs when a career or relationship path runs out of generative space. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of a dynamic life. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the cold mountain wind on the upper ridge does not ask the permission of the monastic builder before it rattles the eaves of the reservoir shed. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our forearms and wrist joints, where we translate a temporary state of structural claustrophobia into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling trapped or flat. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because you feel suffocated in this safe environment, you are fundamentally ungrateful, weak, and permanently banned from true liberation." We do not just navigate an intense period of domestic lag, our thoughts declare. This locked gate is proof that your core is inherently broken and incapable of change. This is the mechanism of turning a temporary pocket of stagnation into a solid identity. The unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural stone well curb for an eternal tomb that must be fortified through even harder mental scrutiny. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours rehearsing the future and replaying the past, desperately trying to build a wall of hypervigilance against the terrifying landscape of human vulnerability. We stay awake documenting every old mistake because we believe that our burning self-criticism is a form of protection, that if we keep the inner dialogue sharp, analytical, and critical, we will somehow force ourselves to remain safely unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for conceptual approval, trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-punishment as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal investigator we carry in our skin. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental enclosures is like trying to preserve a water source by driving the pine roof wedge tighter into the joists. The splits remain trapped in the center, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single boundary of your life to become perfectly flexible through an act of sheer will. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand in the damp well house without immediately picking up the iron mallet to strike your own wrists. When you allow the reality of the closed chamber to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the cedar floorboards in the dark, letting the single corner wedge remain unattached and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of vibrant movement running through your foundation. As you let the bed support the heavy framework of your spine right now, notice how the desperate urge to possess a perfect explanation begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire career or personal history before the night ends. And you do not need to guarantee that your path will be fully unroofed by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect machine that never experiences the sting of claustrophobia or doubt. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the sharp restriction along your forearms, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, open chasm that holds both the raw pine wedge and the quiet grease lamp. You are not the sun-starved mud crust that is currently cracking open in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your upper limbs. Let your wrist bones and your forearm muscles expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of conceptual performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unmapped, wide, and supportive as the unlined sandstone well curb before the first layer of timber planks was ever laid across its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain repository and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The corroded copper key and the hand-planed pine wedge we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old wilderness archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your wrists and your deep forearm joints when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or an analytical answer that might validate your choices or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the metric of human alignment. We live so much of our modern lives inside this structural hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external confirmation of our safety, replaying a minor professional mistake or an unclassified interaction, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable builder during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unadorned self is simply not enough to sustain our place in the valley. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an all-or-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for reassurance, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single, slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping the heavy roof planks so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone frame. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless execution, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner schedule remains unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the logs or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the seasoned cedar does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an unladen chassis, and the raw granite stones do not apologize to the ridge for letting their basin remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to push an overweighted cart through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unuttered arguments, the missed markers, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own pelvic bowl. When we attempt to control the past, or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame. We are acting like Jiro before his hands were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the warping joist exist as a natural configuration of a vast, shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw timber, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your lower spine, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The goal you missed or the checklist you could not deliver is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the bench without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your wrists relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhandled rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving mist that holds the upper gorge terraces in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless defense you tried to build beneath your lower arms, and every anxious reach for reassurance has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant market valley are no longer pulling at your wrists. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal vault completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your forearms and your deep wrist joints are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the unlined stone of your inner nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the mountain bedrock. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your torso. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the winter frost passing directly through the open framework of the stone well curb. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, localized restriction that you held across your forearms is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your uncompleted definitions are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal court case. The corroded copper keys have been laid down on the threshold, the hand-planed pine wedges are resting in the shade, and the critical diagnostic voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The dry stone wells, the caked timber structures, and the safety formulas for tomorrow do not require your presence while the ridge is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire biography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unpolished, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no conceptual performance before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the quiet reservoir is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your arms with an enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence, that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure the flawless explanation, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be locked because it belongs to the raw, uncarved bedrock of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless tracking and transactional approval. Your lower limbs are loose. Your core is heavy like a dark slab of slate resting in the frost, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true security of the dynamic spring lives not in the thickness of the roof planks that shield it, but in its capacity to sit completely open, clear and unmonitored, reflecting the windless winter stars? The deep, unroofed water does not demand a protective wall to justify its clarity, nor does it require an intact ledger of tomorrow's safety parameters to keep from spilling out into the dark. It merely holds the cold, fluid depth of its own nature, allowing the high mountain fog to drift across its open surface without trying to arrest the movement of a single passing cloud. For many hours, your mind has been running its busy structural laboratory, wedging the planks and checking the bolts of your comfort zone, driven by the persistent illusion that your spirit can only remain pure if it is completely insulated from the changing climate of the valley. But as you rest your forearms upon the hemp bedding tonight, you are invited to recognize that the true sanctuary was never the enclosure you built. Your refuge is the unlined stone curb itself, which remains entirely whole, whether the sky above is empty, stormy, or filled with the quiet wash of midnight stars. The localized restriction that gripped your wrist bones since the afternoon is losing its authority now, dissolving into a broad, heavy warmth that spreads through the deep tissue of your arms and fingers. The internal investigator that keeps your system in a perpetual state of defensive leverage has run out of materials to audit, for there are no public standards to maintain in the dark, and no unyielding metrics that require your core to prove its alignment before you are permitted to rest. The text messages you are waiting to receive, the relational equations you wish you could balance through sheer force of logic, and the quiet panic of feeling behind the structural timelines of the world. All of these are merely temporary configurations of form, passing through a changing life. They have no physical weight to reach into this damp, slate-lined room and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that has been watching your breath since the light began to fade. Consider how much vital energy is squandered when we treat our daily routine as an absolute monument that must never be allowed to warp or shift under the pressure of our growth. We build our false sanctuaries out of a deep, understandable fear of uncertainty, believing that if we can only make our lives perfectly predictable, we will finally earn the right to exist without the risk of heartbreak or failure. We turn our emergency shelters into permanent prisons, and then we wonder why the air within our center feels so thinned, parched, and sour when the daylight ends. But the ancient timber beams do not feel a shred of remorse for letting their fibers expand when the winter dampness arrives, and the raw granite curb does not apologize to the ridge for remaining uncovered beneath the sky. You do not have to purchase your safety through total isolation, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will be completely mapped out before your hands are permitted to go entirely slack. Let the heavy responsibility of maintaining the enclosure drop completely away from your fingers now. You are not the gatekeeper of a closed cell, and you are not the monastic builder who must guarantee the absolute purity of the stream through continuous hypervigilance. You are simply a living form resting in the dark, fully supported by a deep, natural intelligence that has never required a single conceptual explanation to keep your heart beating in the silence. The pulse that moves through your wrists does not check the layout of your comfort zone before it agrees to clear the channels. And your lungs do not demand an intact guarantee from the future before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by an ancient structural stability that operates entirely independent of your intellectual performance, resting securely within an evening that requires no final choices before it offers you its peace. If a stray thought begins to drift back toward the legal records, the expectations of the village markets, or the boundaries you wish you could reinforce to shield your vulnerability. Notice the movement without giving it the authority of truth. The slow, regular gurgle of the water beneath the dark floorboards does not apologize for its current, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in the vast auditorium of your awareness, unable to fracture your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the locked copper key. You can care deeply about the valley without driving the pine wedge so tightly into the joists that you split the wood of your own spirit. You can live with the uncertainty of the open gap, letting the cool air clear the stagnant pool without any frantic urgency to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the morning light arrives. Your forearms are heavy now, their muscles dropping their defensive alignment and sinking down into the simple, unrefined texture of the flax sheets, while your lower posture yields its remaining tension to the dark earth beneath the floor. The unfinished arguments, the unuttered apologies, and the irregular structures of the day that has gone have turned into pale, translucent shadows, sliding off the stone rim into the high grass outside the repository shed. The night is completely silent, holding the rocks, the trees, and the reservoirs in a seamless, unbroken cradle that requires no explanation from the wood. You are returning home to the boundless, unroofed space that existed long before you ever learned to build a fortress against your own fear, the native sanctuary, where your soul is fully permitted to drop its final defenses and slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.